talk about the ovaries. Okay, we've got that. And off we go to the first slide. First slide. There we go. I wanted to wish everybody a happy new year. It's a Chinese New Year, started on the 1st. We'll be going on celebrating all 2 weeks of it. The Chinese New Year here in Thailand is being celebrated, as well as we get a chance to celebrate the Greco-Roman calendar, our New Year. And, oh, by the way, the Thailand New Year happens in April. So we get that one too. How nice is that? There's actually going to be a 10-day holiday in April. One of the traditions is getting everybody squirted with water. Nevertheless, it's going to be a lot of fun, and we've had so much fun so far. So everybody sit back and relax. If you've got questions, jump in. We will address them, but keep in mind that today's presentation is the first, because we are not going to be able to cover all of the ovary conversation in one go. So this is part 1, and just to review where we've been. We started out talking about relationships and what it takes to have relationships, and what is the relationship between nutrition and great personal relationships. We went into women's health, men's health, and then we started talking about the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is your hormones, and that's where we are. We're into the hormones. Why are we doing this is that we want everybody to live a happy, healthy life all the way to the terminus. That is, most people, they die too long and live too short, right? Our goal is to live long and prosper, right, Mr. Spock, okay? And we will be able to do that if we take care of our bodies, and we take care of our minds, and we take care of each other. So here we are, the hormones. Again, the endocrine system is made up of glands. These glands secrete hormones into your bloodstream, and the bloodstream then travels these hormones throughout the entire body, looking for the receptors. Each one of these hormones is looking for its particular receptor. That receptor then brings it in and causes something to happen. And if you can remember also, is that there's a negative feedback loop, so that we can keep in mind the cascading events that may take place and get them shut down. And we will touch base again on that, because the ovaries have that opportunity to generate the estrogen, which then can shut down the hypothalamus and shut down the follicle stimulating hormones and the lysing hormones. All right. Again, it's a chemical transmitter. It's not an electrical transmitter. It operates chemically within your body. And we've seen the interaction between the nervous system and the endocrine system that happens in the hypothalamus. We've seen the lipid system and the endocrine system and its interaction at the adrenal and the pineal glands. So here we are, getting right into the subject, and oh my gosh, it's the ovaries. And what do you think you know? What is it that you think you know about the ovaries that's going to be of interest, and what kind of things are we going to be able to teach today that's going to change that thinking? And one of the first things that I learned during this research was that the ovaries produce eggs, and they release them in the fallopian tubes for fertilization of sperm. And most of us already knew that. Most everybody gets that by this time in life. But do you know that every woman is born with all the eggs she's ever going to have? That is amazing to me. And then last week, remember that we learned that the man is generating up to 12 million sperm per day. That means he needs to get rid of 12 million sperm per day. Okay, so that means over the course of his life, he's going to generate 40 trillion or 400 trillion sperm or something along those lines. We got that last week, and I found that amazing. And then, so we're going to touch base on that in one of our videos. It's kind of funny. The ovarian hormones. How about this? Did you know you had 3 different types of estrogen? All right. So there are 3 different kinds of estrogen, and we'll learn a little bit more about that and what each one does. But the interesting thing is I found throughout all of this exercise in terms of talking about health is that how much we don't know what does happen and why it happens or how it happens and so forth. So here we are with many different things, and you know how they gloss it over in the papers is that they talk about, well, we don't know about the interactions of this, or we don't have enough information, or there's more research going on, and you go, holy macro, we don't know everything, and we don't know about just these 3 different types of estrogen. We only know that it's a female sex hormone. But as you know from previous exercises and so forth, it's not just the female hormone, just like testosterone. Women need it, men need it. Estrogen, women need it, and men need it. It's just the amounts that are different. Okay. Then you also have something called an anti-Müllerian hormone, AMH, and we'll get into that. There's also progesterone. Many folks know about that from the standpoint of menopause and progesterone cream, the use of that to try to relieve menopausal symptoms. I love this next one. This one is a hormone called Relaxin. Don't worry, Samuel, you've got some relaxin in you too. So we're all got a little bit of relaxin, and we'll find out what relaxin does. And then, of course, testosterone and what that testosterone does in a woman's body. And then there's interferon that helps stop things from happening. And we'll touch just a little bit on that in the negative the negative reforcing cycle. All right, if you don't know where the ovaries are, they're at the ends of the fallopian tubes. No, I don't want to go backwards. I'm going to go this way. There we go. Back over here. Can you see my pointer, by the way, Mila? Okay, fantastic. That's helpful. All right. The ovaries are these right here, and they're always pictured as eggs because they kind of sort of look like eggs until you take them out of the body, and then they fall apart and look terrible. So we're not going to show you any pictures of any dissected parts of the body, but nevertheless, they're located here, and these fingers, this is the fallopian tube here, and this is the uterus right there. Okay. So that's where they're located. There are 2 of them, just so that if one goes bad, the other one stays there. Men and women want to reproduce, and they need to have multiple ways of doing that. We learned about the duplicative nature of our glands when we talked about the pituitary, right here. The thymus and the parathymus. And the parathymus, remember that there were 4 parathymus glands, all in there, so that we have backup. Inside of the ovaries, of course, we've got the blood feeding it, and it has to have the hormones come through the blood, so that's incredibly important. And the egg actually leaves the ovary through the side of the ovary. So it comes from this basic genesis, around through here and then comes out, and it's picked up by the fallopian tube here. All right. Like I said, it all is in the brain. So sex is all in the brain. Everybody knows that. Your biggest sex organ is not something you see. It's something inside your head. And generally speaking, it all starts with the hypothalamus. All right. The hypothalamus is the connection with the nervous system and other parts of the brain. And it sends the gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GRH, to the pituitary gland, which generates the light-sensing hormone, or LH, and the follicle stimulating hormone, which goes through the blood and gets down to the ovaries. The follicle stimulating hormone does exactly what it says. It creates for the generation of follicles, which the egg attaches to in the uterus, but that hormone has to be generated in the ovary. And then at the same time, you've got the light-sensing hormone, which tells the ovaries to start the egg producing process. That is the maturing of the egg, since the eggs are already there, is you're going to start maturing them. And then also in that process, generating estrogen. And estrogen is necessary for that maturation process to all take place, along with a lot of other things, like we learned how important it is to bone creation. There is a negative feedback mechanism that as the ovaries generate more and more estrogen, it sends a signal to the hypothalamus to stop generating the GRH, and so the process can return. And we will talk more about the cycles. Okay, and I'm going to call them the bicycles, because we have two types of cycles, the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle, and we'll get into that in the next presentation, because we need the anatomy and the functioning process and talk about the hormones today, and then we'll get more into the cycles next time. All right, so the eggs come out and they generate, and somewhere's in this pathway here, they get fertilized, and then once they're fertilized, they will start splitting cells. Right? And if all goes well in the pregnancy cycle, then they will attach to the lining of the uterus here, embed in the lining of the uterus, and then start pulling nutrients from the mother at that point, and the baby will start developing inside the uterus. All right, estrogens. And I'm going to try to do this really very particularly. I hope that I can do this with a lot of enthusiasm. But one of the big deals here is that we are having the translation done so that our Chinese participants can follow along. Estrogens are a group of hormones that play the important role of growth in the reproductive development of women. Estradiol is the strongest of the three estrogens. It's also one of the least populous of those, but because of its power, it has an overwhelming impact upon the women. Estradiol is important in the development of women through childbearing age. So if you were to think about the other two, this one would be like 90% or 94% of the total power of the estrogen, but it's certainly not the most populous. Does that make sense? Okay, so you have that. Then estradiol, Estriol is generated is produced by the placenta inside of the uterus. So that happens during pregnancy. And then estrone is your most populous form of estrogen in the body. And if you take this one, you would say that in population of total estrogen, this one would be well over 90% of the total estrogen in your body, but it is also the least strength. So it's a way of taking care of the estrogen in the female body through postmenopausal process. Okay, low estrogen, the common cause of symptoms creates menopause. So when you stop generating the signals to the ovaries to generate the eggs, then you start having menopause. And so you're not generating as much estrogen, which then can create hot flashes, fatigue, reduced sex drive, and depression, because many women feel less feminine when their cycles are interrupted. And that creates for a situation of depression. So if you're in the situation of being a reinforcing person, what you want to do is to reinforce the benefit of menopause, and also in terms of the transition from reproductive to long life. From reproduction to improve quality of life. For women who are postmenopausal who still struggle with these symptoms of low estrogen, there may be other reasons, and oftentimes they're treated with Estrone. Okay, and we just look at the schedule, and this is for information purposes only. It's certainly not a law. There are women who go into menopause extremely early, like in their early 40s or late 30s, and then there are women who don't go into menopause until they reach their 70s. But for the most part, women go into menopause right at that 50-year mark, and it can last longer or shorter depending upon the health and the well-being of the woman going through it. So as we'll get to the end of our presentation, we'll talk more about hormonal feeding nutrition and how we can help lessen the impact of the change of life that takes place in menopause. Down here at the bottom, you'll again see this list of hormone.org. That, I'm proud to say, is the Endocrine Society. The Endocrine Society has now accepted me as a member, and it's a group of esteemed scientists and doctors and physicians and treaters, and so now I'm a member of the Endocrine Society. Okay, low estrogen symptoms, and if you're going through it, you're very familiar with it. If you know somebody who's gone through it, you're pretty familiar with these sorts of symptoms, but let's just go through them right away. Menstrual periods become less frequent, and then they stop. Okay, they become less frequent. They also become more where we can't tell when they're going to occur. Okay, so that once they get out of cycle, you get out of cycle, you start feeling out of cycle, and the next thing you're into it. You've got the hot flashes and night sweats, and you have the that you know what they are. I know that you get hot and cold. That's what the hot flashes are. Okay, there's trouble sleeping, there's dryness and thinning in the vagina, there's a lowering of the sex drive. There are also mood swings, dry skin, and sometimes women get headaches, or what are known as menstrual migraines, right before their next period, if that period is going to come. And then in men, low estrogen can cause belly fat and low sex drive. Excess estrogen, in women with excess estrogen, the problems are weight gain, generally speaking around the waist, hips, and thighs. Menstrual problems such as light or heavy bleeding. So for instance, if it's going to be one or the other and not something in the middle, and it's going to be hard to be able to tell. Worsening of any premenstrual syndromes that may occur. Fibrocystic lumps in the breast. You could get fibroids or fibrocystic lumps. There'll be fatigue, loss of sex drive, and a feeling of depression or anxiousness. So anytime your estrogen becomes out of balance, you're going to start seeing these kinds of symptoms, and you be able to experience them. Now, there are different approaches, and USANA does have an approach to this in the nutritional world. Estrogen, it was improved about 3 years ago from Ester Pro, and so it's there as a phytoestrogen, as plant-based, so it doesn't have the negative issues associated with artificial estrogens, that is chemical estrogens that might be used in pills or medications. The multi-Müllerian hormone, AMH, that's a very interesting hormone, and I need to move you guys off the page here just a little bit. There we go. Is that I never knew anything about this one. I hadn't heard about it before, but it's incredibly important. It acts as a gatekeeper for fertility and fetal development. During pregnancy, the anti-Müllerian hormone is essential to fetal development. The hormone assists in a male fetus's reproductive development. Prior to birth, AMH is made in the fetus's testes or ovaries. Okay, 8 weeks after the conception, a fetus has both Müllerian female or Wolferian male ducts, which can develop into male or female reproductive system. If the fetus has an XY chromosome or is male, the testes will produce AMH, that's the anti-Müllerian hormone, and the Müllerian ducts will disappear. Once that happens, then the testosterone, okay, will promote the development of the male system within the woman's womb. So not only is the woman generating testosterone, but if she has a male baby inside of her, she is also generating testosterone within that male baby. If the fetus is an XX or a female, if it has XX chromosomes or is female, the lack of testosterone will cause the Wolferian duct to vanish, and the Müllerian duct will then develop into the female reproductive system. AMH also has a role in puberty and in the adult ovaries, help in early development of the follicles. So as you need to, a woman generates her follicles, then it's the anti-Müllerian hormone that helps with that. So the follicles hold and support the eggs before fertilization, and high number of follices means the ovaries can produce a large amounts of AMH, and AMH levels can be measured to determine how many follicles a woman has. It also is, there we go, a way of monitoring that to be able to tell how many more eggs are in, but we'll get to that. If a male fetus doesn't make enough AMH, the Müllerian duct doesn't disappear, which can lead to abnormal development of the reproductive system. And that does occur, unfortunately. Müllerian duct syndrome is rare. Symptoms include having low or no sperm count. In women, AMH is produced in adulthood. Measuring AMH's good levels will determine a woman's remaining egg supply. And AMH levels are also used to determine the hormone doses during in vitro fertilization. So they would monitor your AMH to determine the amount of hormone that needs to be added to assist in vitro fertilization. For most women, AMH levels are at their highest during puberty and remain constant level until menopause. So the AMH won't decline until you're actually into menopause. When there are no more ovarian follicles, levels of AMH will decrease. So as you go through the process of menopause, then the follicles start decreasing, and so will the AMH. Low levels of AMH may be related to primary ovarian insufficiency. High levels of hormone may be due to polycystic ovarian syndrome. And we'll hear a little bit more about that in the videos. Then measuring AMH levels alone isn't sufficient for a clear diagnosis of either POI or PCOS. Progesterone is a steroid secreted by the corpus luteum inside of the uterus, a contemporary endocrine gland producer after ovulation during the second half of the menstrual cycle. Okay, prepares the endometrium for the potential of pregnancy after ovulation. It triggers the lining to thicken to accept the fertilized egg that is within the uterus. Prohibits the muscle contractions in the uterus that could cause an egg rejection. That is a really important thing. So once you have an egg, it will continue producing progesterone. Your body will continue producing progesterone so that your body doesn't have contractions anymore. So if you're not going to go into menopause or into your cycle, then you won't have that. So you won't lose the egg. Okay, in the uterus. Prohibits muscle when producing the high levels of progesterone. The body will not ovulate, so you won't generate another egg while you're generating progesterone. Okay, so if you're going to have twins, they're going to come out as twin eggs at the beginning. You won't get another one after the egg is in the lining of your uterus. If a woman does not become pregnant, the corpus luteum breaks down, lowering progesterone, and now the body, that sparks your menstruation cycle. If the body does conceive, the progesterone continues to stimulate the body to provide food vessels into the endometrium, and that will feed the growing fetus. The hormone prepares the uterus so it can accept the fertilized egg. Once the placenta develops, it begins to secrete progesterone, supporting the corpus luteum. Thus, this causes the levels to remain elevated throughout the pregnancy. So after your egg is embedded in the uterus, now the placenta of the uterus, that is the casing, the blood, will then generate progesterone in large amounts to help the baby's development and keep you off your cycle while you are pregnant. Okay, and your body won't produce any more eggs during that period. It helps also, along with prolactin, to prepare the breasts for milk production. So the progesterone and the prolactin, which is another hormone that we learned about earlier, it comes out of the pituitary gland, for helping the breast generate the milk. When women have low levels of progesterone, there will be abnormal menstrual cycles or may struggle to conceive because the progesterone does not trigger the proper environment for the conceived egg to grow. Okay, so the progesterone is low, then it would be very difficult for women to have children. Women who have low progesterone and who do succeed in getting pregnant are at high risk for losing that baby because the hormone is not helping the uterus by helping to generate the placenta to hold the egg in place. So it's a high-risk pregnancy in a low with low progesterone production. I love this name right here, Relaxin. And Relaxin is a hormone. It's hormone secreted by the ovaries by the corpus luteum, which is inside the ovary, by the way. The corpus luteum is the signaling where the eggs are initially reside. And then they develop that initially there, and then they're kicked around inside the uterus until they pop out. Okay. When a woman is pregnant, the placenta will also generate the hormone, as will the uterine lining. Men also have relaxin, which comes from their prostate gland, and it's found in semen. However, we've got no idea what it does in men, other than maybe it's the hormone that makes us sit in front of the TV, drink beer, and watch football. All right, relaxin increases after ovulation, where it is believed to relax the wall of the uterus and prepare it for pregnancy. If a woman does not conceive, levels drop until the next cycle. If a woman does conceive, relaxin levels grow through the first trimester, aiding in the implantation and placenta growth. This hormone also stops contractions as the tiny baby grows to prevent early delivery. Relaxin helps to relax the ligaments of the pelvis to allow it to stretch, assisting in vaginal birth. And one would assume that that is the reason why it's called relaxin, and really interesting hormone. Other effects have surfaced recently in studies. The new relaxin peptides have been discovered. Relaxin is proven to lessen tissue fibrous in the organs and can also promote wound healing. Relaxin has also been found to reduce blood pressure by relaxing blood vessels. This has led more study to the benefits of relaxin peptide treatment for certain diseases. Now, we learned a bit about the need for nitroglycerin or nitrous oxide to open up blood vessels in the male last week. And these new discoveries may also help us understand the reasons for relaxin in the prostate. Okay, everybody follow that? Any questions? Okay. So testosterone in a healthy woman, the ovaries and the adrenal glands produce 40 to 50% of the total progesterone. The remaining is coming from the peripheral tissues and various different other glands as precursors from the testosterones that have been gotten into the blood. So one of the issues, if you have more fat, you're going to generate more testosterone. And for us men, if we have too much estrogen, we're going to have too much fat. And then we're going to generate more estrogen. So one of the downsides of obesity in men is female characteristics, whereas the generation here is that the women need it for their cycles, as well as for their health and benefit, for their bone structure, for their strength and flexibility, as well as attitudes, right? Research shows testosterone may improve sexual function and desire in women. So this is the component of it, to be able to have a desire for sex, which would then cause the human race to continue to grow. Okay, so generally speaking, all the signals come from the brain again, come into the bloodstream, and then feed the adrenal gland, the ovaries, and testes, and then there's a reverse cycle over here, and that is inhibin, and we'll see that inhibin A and inhibin B, and that comes back to kick the hypothalamus to stop sending signals to the pituitary gland. All right, Mila, we're going to start out with this. You're going to find one of my favorite producers at the top, and we'll go through as many as we can to stay on schedule. How are we doing on schedule, by the way? We should be about halfway through.
Yeah, we are.
Okay. What I want to do is to get to the first three, and then we'll see where we need to go. We'll choose one or the other of those polycystic ovarian syndrome ones, and then hit that ovarian cancer. All right, over to you, Mila.
Okay. Let me share my screen.
Notice that every time we talk about a new system, highlight its importance by saying how you die without it. Like, without your muscular and skeletal systems, you'd collapse into an inert bag of goo. Or how, if we magically removed your respiratory or circulatory system, you'd die in a couple of minutes because your cells wouldn't have oxygen. That's because most of our body's systems are just trying to keep us alive minute to minute. But one of those systems doesn't really care if you live or die, at least not until it's done its job. It's how every living thing gets its start, but it doesn't really kick in until puberty, and even then, it's more concerned about investing in the future than keeping you alive. When it comes to your reproductive system, it's not concerned about you so much as it's concerned about your alleles, your genetic code, and the future of the human species, which are no small stakes. This system includes our primary internal sex organs, the gonads, like testes and ovaries, the various sex hormones they secrete, and the gametes, sperm and eggs, they produce. It also includes the glands, ducts, external genitalia, and particular brain parts that help the gonads and gametes do what they need to do, which basically is mate, combine alleles, and make babies. Now, all animals have their own particular and fascinating anatomical methods for getting their gametes together, and we could do a whole course just on that and never run out of material, and let me tell you, I would like to do that. But while we may seem kinda tame compared to animals that turn bright red or bite off penises or starve themselves for a chance to breed, our systems are still pretty complex. In fact, it's gonna take most of the month to get through all of our various anatomical parts and hormones and explain how sexy time, fertilization, pregnancy, and development work, starting today with the female anatomy. And remember, this is nothing to be shy about. When talking about sex, we are talking about the future of humanity. So when we talk about sex, we're talking about spreading our alleles around, but when we visualize sex, most of what we picture are our anatomies. Who has what and what goes where. In an anatomical female, that involves the vulva, which includes the mons pubis over the pubic bone, and labia majora and labia minora, the elongated skin folds that surround the vestibule, which contains both the urethral and vaginal openings. Beyond that is the vagina, which I'm sure you know is how menstrual blood and babies leave the body and how sperm gets in. But as much as we tend to put all the focus on the bathing suit parts, those are only the genitalia, the external sexual organs. And they're really just a means of getting gametes together. Reproductively speaking, they're the least important parts of the system. The ground control of the female reproductive anatomy, the place where the orders are given, are of course the ovaries. Their main job is to produce and release female gametes and sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. You'll remember from biology that gametes are haploid cells, meaning that they only have one set of chromosomes and are formed by meiosis. When a sperm fuses with an egg, they make a diploid cell, which has all the genetic instructions required to make a baby, and pretty much everything about how our reproductive systems work is designed to make that happen. Each ovary lives inside a fibrous sac that consists of a layer of connective tissue called the tunica albuginea, and another layer of cuboidal epithelial cells called the germinal epithelium, which is actually part of the peritoneum that lines the abdominal cavity. The ovary itself contains a cortex that houses developing eggs, and a medulla that contains most of the ovary's blood vessels and nerves. But the business of passing on alleles and saving humanity really begins in the basic reproductive units in the cortex, the ovarian follicles. These are tiny sac-like structures that each hold a single primary oocyte, a sort of incomplete proto-egg, along with a bunch of supporting follicle cells around it. Females are born with essentially all of these early versions of eggs in all of the primordial follicles they will ever have, around 1 million at the time of birth. But right around birth, the oocytes stop developing. They get stuck at the first stage of meiosis, and they stay that way for years, sometimes forever. The actual process of egg creation, or oogenesis, is delayed until puberty when the rest of the body is physically ready to reproduce. Now this works differently for us than it does for some other animals. Like if you're a salmon or a mayfly, then all of your eggs will mature at once, and then you'll mate, reproduce, and usually die in quick succession. I mean, people talk about living fast and dying young, but that's too fast. So human eggs mature one by one, almost constantly, doled out so that every month or so a mature egg is either fertilized or dies to make way for a new egg. This should all sound familiar if you were born with female anatomy or know anyone who was, because it's a big part of the well-known monthly menstrual cycle. But the truth is, menstruation is only one part of one cycle. The menstrual cycle is what happens in the uterus to prepare for a fertilized egg. The other cycle, the ovarian cycle, is all about the maturation of the follicle and egg, and it's what actually drives the menstrual cycle. Every day, even before birth, birth, a bunch of follicles will begin a process of maturation, very slowly morphing from primordial follicles into what's known as late tertiary follicles, which are the ones that will support a fully developed egg. This process takes 375 days. But out of that bunch of follicles, usually about 20 or so, only one follicle will end up supporting a single mature egg. The rest won't get the hormonal boost they need to bring the egg to completion. This is what happens to the ones that start maturing before puberty, for example, so they undergo atresia, a kind of programmed self-destruction. And because I keep mentioning puberty, which you've probably been through yourself, it should come as no surprise that all of this activity is regulated by sex hormones. Starting around puberty, the hypothalamus and pituitary set up two concurrent cycles: the ovarian cycle in the ovaries, which ripens eggs and secretes sex hormones, and the menstrual, or the uterine cycle, which prepares the uterus to capture and nourish any mature, fertilized eggs. When puberty begins, the hypothalamus starts up the ovarian cycle by secreting gonadotropin-releasing hormone about once a month. This is a sex hormone that stimulates the anterior pituitary to release two more hormones: follicle-stimulating hormone, you'll often hear it called FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. The follicle-stimulating hormone lives up to its name by stimulating the growth of a follicle, but only one, the one that happens to be the furthest along in development at the time. The FSH drives that one lucky follicle to keep growing by triggering the follicle itself to secrete its own estrogen hormones, which locally signal the follicle to mature even more. That surge of follicle-secreted estrogen then ends up stimulating the pituitary to secrete another pulse of luteinizing hormone to finish the job. The LH gets to work on the oocyte that's been dormant inside the follicle and triggers it to finally start dividing again, getting it to complete meiosis 1 and move on to metaphase 2. This whole process takes about 14 days, at the end of which the follicle, which is now mature, pushes up against the ovary wall, ruptures, and with the help of enzymes breaches the wall and ejects a single, now mature oocyte. Congratulations! You've just ovulated! The damaged follicle now slows its estrogen production while morphing into a different structure called the corpus luteum, which eventually degenerates. But first, it releases its final hormonal swan song, a bunch of progesterone, a little bit of estrogen, and some inhibin that together stop the release of FSH and LH. They also prepare the uterus to receive the oocyte, which is now on its way down a fallopian tube where it might meet a nice young sperm. The tubes are about 10 centimeters long, and interestingly, they aren't actually connected to the ovaries. This means that when the egg pushes through the ovary, it has to float a short way through the peritoneal cavity before it's caught up by a fallopian tube. Now, only if and when an egg fuses with a sperm does it actually complete meiosis 2 and officially become an ovum. But whether it's fertilized or not, the egg works its way down the tube until it enters the uterus, a hollow, thick-walled, and very stretchable muscular organ that sits anterior to the rectum and posterior-superior to the bladder and ends with the cervix. And the uterine wall is composed of 3 layers: the perimetrium on the outside, the bulky, smooth muscle myometrium that contracts during labor, and the inner mucosal lining, the endometrium, which consists of a thin, deep basal layer and an outer functional layer. If fertilization does happen, then the new embryo snuggles into the endometrium for gestation, but the uterus is only receptive to implantation for a short time, about a week after ovulation. If the egg isn't fertilized, that outer functional layer sloughs off. And that's the first phase of the uterine or menstrual cycle, the series of changes that the endometrium goes through every 28 days or so in response to changing hormone levels and in coordination with the ovarian cycle. The shedding of the functional layer is triggered when the progesterone and estrogens that were being produced by the corpus luteum start to drop, about 10 days after ovulation. This phase lasts about 5 days. Meanwhile, the FSH and LH released from the anterior pituitary start to rise again, stimulating the next round of follicles which begin to make estrogen. This heralds the start of phase 2 of the menstrual cycle, the proliferative or pre-ovulatory phase, which typically lasts from days 6 to 14 of the cycle. The rising estrogen levels in the follicles stimulate the regeneration of the endometrium, building a cushy, well-vascularized habitat for another potential fertilized egg to call home. And after the next egg is released, the final secretory or post-ovulatory phase begins. This is when the ruptured follicle forms in the corpus luteum, and if fertilization didn't happen, the corpus will stop producing progesterone and the endometrium will start to shed its functional layer and it starts all over again. But if by this time the egg has met a nice sperm and gotten fertilized, then the pulse of progesterone from the corpus triggers even more thickening of the functional layer of the endometrium and a secretion of nutrients that will tide an embryo over until it has implanted itself in the blood-rich lining. Which is a big if. Like its whole separate video big, so that's where we're gonna go next time. But for now, you learned all about female reproductive anatomy, how sex hormones affect oogenesis and ovulation, and how the ovarian and menstrual cycles mature and release oocytes and create a comfy uterine environment for a fertilized egg. Thank you to our headmaster of learning.
There we go. All right. So Anything coming out from that you want to comment on? I love that video. It's so full of everything. And Thecla, thank you for joining us, and Happy New Year to Jishem. Hey. All right. Hello, hello, hello. All right, Mila, let's take it to the next one.
The functional anatomy of the reproductive system. Okay, so before we begin the functional anatomy, we're going to just look at some characteristics of the female reproductive system. So keep in mind that there are cyclical changes that occur via the menstrual cycle and menstruation. There's periods of restricted fertility, and that is occurring during ovulation. And females have a limited gamete production. In other words, females are born with a set number of oogonia. Oogonia, these are the female gametes. Females are born with a set number. All right, we don't make more oogonia throughout life. This is a pool that's established at birth, and that's all the oogonia females will ever have. Okay, so now on to the functional anatomy of the female reproductive tract. All right, so to begin with, let's look at the location for the ovaries. And if we just take a look, so these are there's two ovaries, right? We have bilateral symmetry. So if you divide this image in half here, there's an ovary on the right and one on the left. So we're going to zoom in just on one of these ovaries here. And when we zoom in on this ovary and we look inside of it, what's going on within this ovary is that you have follicles, and within the follicles, they will contain developing ovum. We're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to the menstrual cycle. So for now, think about the ovaries in terms of the location for the developing or the maturing ovum. Once that mature ovum is ready, it will leave the ovary and it'll travel into the uterine tube. If fertilization is going to occur, it occurs in the uterine tube. We'll put a big X. X marks the spot. That's where fertilization takes place. Then either the zygote, if it's a fertilized egg, correct, or the mature ovum, whichever the case may be, will travel to the uterus. If it is a fertilized egg, a zygote, that's going to be implanted into the wall of the uterus. So I'll just put a Z in the wall of the uterus. If the developing, or the mature ovum rather, is not fertilized, it's going to continue to pass through the uterus, through the vagina, and out of the body. So that gives you a nice little overview of what's going on in the female reproductive tract. We're going to be looking at details for each of these structures and looking at how hormones are related and how that ovum develops, how the egg gets fertilized, and if it does get fertilized, how the fetus develops. So we're going to be hitting each of those in separate video lectures. Okay, so these are the functions of the granulosa cells. For right now, you're not going to have a clue what the granulosa cells are. And so when we discuss the menstrual cycle, please be sure to come back and look at the functions for the granulosa cells. Okay, now continuing on then with the reproductive tract of the female. So we're going to focus momentarily on the uterus as well as the vagina. And I'm not going to go through and read all of this information to you because you can read it. What I want to focus on is the wall of the uterus. There's 3 layers to the wall of the uterus. There's the outermost layer called the parametrium, and that has epithelial cells and some connective tissues. There's a middle layer called the myometrium, so you know that's composed of smooth muscle. And then the most important layer of all for us is the endometrium. And I say that because when we discuss the menstrual cycle, we'll be talking a lot about the endometrium, the innermost layer of the uterine wall. And then, of course, over here is the vagina, the female organ of copulation. Lots of smooth muscle associated with that, and lots of glands. Okay, so I'll let you read the rest of the information on these slides. So then we move into the uterine tubes, or also called the fallopian tubes, also called the oviducts. Be sure that you're familiar with using any of those terms. Now, we talked about the ovum and how it matures in the ovary. So here we have the mature ovum. Okay, and you don't quite yet have details on how that happens, but you will soon. So once you have that mature ovum, it gets transported to the uterine tube and then to the uterus. So this would be the uterus over here. And remember, the uterine tube is where fertilization takes place. We need to talk about the infundibulum and the fimbriae. The fimbriae are these finger-like projections. The infundibulum would be located right above the fimbriae, and they help pick up the ovum that's been released from the ovary. So once that mature ovum leaves the ovary, the fimbriae and the infundibulum, they're going to help move that mature ovum into the uterine tube. And that's done through mostly peristalsis initially, and then it turns into ciliary action that moves that ovum through that uterine tube. And it takes about 4 days for that mature ovum to reach the uterus. So that concludes this segment.
Now, the next one is a lot more complex presentation. We'll get into the hormonal ties, and I hope you can stay with him as much as we can to follow along. But the science is important, and therefore this presentation is included here. So over to you, Mila.
Known as ovaries. Now, a gonad is basically a structure that produces gametes, and that means that our ovaries are the reproductive organs of the female, and they are responsible for producing the female gametes known as egg cells or ovum. Now, not only that, but the ovaries also act as endocrine glands. They produce and release special types of hormones known as the female sex hormones. So they produce estrogen as well as progesterone. Now, before we discuss what these two hormones are and what their function is, let's briefly discuss the structure of our female reproductive system. So we have two ovaries inside our female reproductive system. We have one and we have the second one. So inside the ovary, we basically have the maturation and the production of the egg cells, our ovum. So once our ovum is basically mature, it will undergo a process known as ovulation, and the ovary will release that egg cell, that ovum, into a cavity known as our peritoneal cavity. And that ovum, the egg cell, will then travel from the peritoneal cavity into a canal known as our fallopian tube. So the fallopian tube basically connects our ovary to the uterus. Now, eventually, the ovum will make its way to our uterus, which is this section here. And if we have the presence of sperm cells inside the female reproductive system, then the sperm cell can combine with our ovum in a process known as fertilization, and that produces our diploid cell, the zygote. And once the zygote is inside the uterus, it attaches onto the outer membrane, the lining of the uterus, known as the endometrium. And what the endometrium does is it supplies the developing zygote with the nutrients that it needs to actually develop further. Now, if there is no sperm cells found in our female reproductive system, then when the egg cell actually reaches our uterus, what happens is the egg cell, the ovum, along with the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, is released into the surrounding environment. And this process takes place about a month in the female human organism. So this process is known as the menstrual cycle. So let's zoom in on our zygote, on our ovary. We basically get the following diagram. So this diagram basically describes the process by which our follicles mature into our ovum, into our egg cell. So we begin with these tiny little dots known as the primary follicles. They mature into the oocyte, then they become the secondary follicle, and that secondary follicle eventually undergoes the process of ovulation. This is the release of the secondary follicle. It's the release of the mature ovum, the mature egg cell, into the cavity known as the peritoneal cavity. And then, once released into our peritoneal cavity, it travels into our fallopian tube and eventually into our uterus. Now, the remaining portion of our secondary follicle, the remaining portion of the ovarian follicle, which is the basic unit of structure of our ovary, this remaining portion that is left behind in the ovary eventually becomes a structure known as the corpus luteum. And this is a very important structure in both our menstrual cycle as well as pregnancy. And we'll see what its function is in just a moment. So let's discuss these two hormones. Let's begin with estrogen and then let's move on to progesterone. So estrogen is a steroid hormone. That means it's lipid soluble. So that means it can easily travel across a cell membrane, and it basically binds to the protein receptor inside that cell. And eventually estrogen enters our nucleus of the cell, and it acts on the cell on a transcriptional level. It influences the transcription of our cell. Now, estrogen itself is stimulated by our luteinizing hormone as well as the follicle stimulating hormone that are released by the anterior pituitary gland. And FSH as well as LH are both stimulated by the gonadotropin releasing hormone released by the hypothalamus. So estrogen is basically released by two structures. So estrogen is initially released by our ovarian follicle, this structure here. Now, once our ovulation process actually takes place and we form the corpus luteum, then the corpus luteum begins to release our estrogen. So we have two structures inside our ovary that are capable of releasing our estrogen hormone. So estrogen is released by the ovarian follicle, which is the basic unit of the structure inside the ovary. It is also released by the corpus luteum, which is the portion of the follicle that is left behind in the ovary following the release of our ovum, the mature female gamete, into our peritoneal cavity and eventually into the fallopian tube. Now, what exactly is the purpose of estrogen? So basically, when the secondary follicle is still inside our ovary, estrogen is released by that follicle, and what it basically does is it generates our endometrium. It is responsible for generating and thickening the endometrium, which is the layer of membrane in the uterus that serves as the binding site for our zygote. The zygote is the combination of the sperm and our egg. This process of combining is known as fertilization. Now, the second purpose of estrogen is basically to promote the development of female secondary sex characteristics, such as our enlargement of breasts, as well as the growth of body hair in different parts of the body. It also is responsible for increasing the muscle mass and bone mass of women. Now, let's move on to the other type of female sex hormone known as progesterone. So, progesterone is also a steroid hormone. That means it's formed from cholesterol and it is lipid soluble. It passes across the cell membrane and it binds onto protein receptors inside the target cell. Now, progesterone is stimulated by the luteinizing hormone LH that is released by the anterior pituitary gland. So, as our amount of LH in the blood increases, the amount of progesterone released also increases. Now, progesterone is initially released by the corpus luteum. So after ovulation takes place and the ovum is released into our peritoneal cavity, the corpus luteum eventually forms, and that corpus luteum begins to release our progesterone hormone. Now, once our corpus luteum actually degenerates during the process of pregnancy, our placenta, the structure that basically supplies the growing fetus with nutrients, begins to release our progesterone. So we have two structures that are capable of releasing progesterone. Initially, it's the corpus luteum, but eventually, when the corpus luteum degenerates during the process of pregnancy, it's the placenta that releases our progesterone. Now, what exactly is the function of progesterone? So it has many important functions, and one of the most important functions is the maintenance of the endometrium. So it's the estrogen that generates and thickens that endometrium, but it's progesterone that maintains the endometrium as our ovum travels through the fallopian tube and during the process of pregnancy. So progesterone is used to maintain the endometrium during the menstrual cycle as well as during pregnancy if the sperm actually combines with our egg. Now, it also inhibits the process of lactation during pregnancy, and it also decreases the ability of the smooth muscle inside the uterus to basically contract. And this is important because we don't want our muscles in the uterus to contract too early during the process of pregnancy. So this is our ovary. So once again, the ovary is the female gonad that acts as an endocrine gland and forms two important female sex hormones, the estrogen and progesterone. And both of these play an important role in not only the female menstrual cycle, but also in the process of pregnancy.
All right. All right. We need to turn on your mic there a little bit, Mila. But basically, has anybody got any questions or comments based upon this? You pick up something that you want to share with the group. We got a good orientation, and now we've had reinforcement of that same information. And now, I believe the next one, Mila, is on PCOS, right?
Ovarian cycle.
Yeah. Okay.
We're going to talk about the ovarian cycle. The ovaries are two structures in a female's reproductive system that produce her eggs. Each month, her eggs go through a maturation process called the ovarian cycle. And that cycle creates a secondary oocyte that can be then fertilized by a sperm to result in a pregnancy. The ovarian cycle is also responsible for what we commonly know as the menstrual cycle. Basically, the primary oocytes that are destined to be ovulated will develop in the ovaries, complete meiosis 1 just before ovulation, and then they'll be ejected out of the ovary as a secondary oocyte to be picked up by the fimbriae and swept into the uterine tube to hope for fertilization. So let's start from the beginning. Inside the ovaries, eggs develop in structures called follicles, these purple circles here, and they start off as primordial follicles. And so what a follicle is, I'll just blow that up for you. It's one primary oocyte, so an egg cell, surrounded by a layer of cells called granulosa cells. And the granulosa cells develop and become more numerous as the follicle matures. Now the granulosa cells also secrete a few hormones, estrogen, a little progesterone, and some inhibin. And we'll talk about the functions of those a little bit later on. So let's put a timeline on this. Now the ovarian cycle lasts 28 days. This is day 0 here at the primordial follicle, and we're going counterclockwise. All the way over here, this is day 13. Here, where the secondary oocyte gets ejected, or ovulated, that's day 14. And then the rest of the time spent getting back to the primordial follicle stage are days 15 through 28. So now you have an idea of about how long this all takes. So you remember when we said that the granulosa cells produce hormones? Well, as the follicles develop over the first 13 days, and you can see the changes between the one here and the one here, it's got a lot more purple cells around here. Those are granulosa cells. So the number of granulosa cells goes up. And since they produce hormones, what do you think happens to the hormone levels in the blood? They go up. So that's sort of just a general point. So keep that in mind. But first we'll jump back to these. We know these are primordial follicles here. The next stage of development are these guys here, and these are called primary follicles. And in the primary follicles, the layers of granulosa cells and the oocyte, the egg, start to be separated by this other layer that starts to form between them. That's called the zona pellucida, and I'll draw it here in light blue. And even though the egg I've drawn in blue, there's still a layer of zona pellucida. Even though the egg is originally drawn in blue because I wanted to draw the egg in blue, there's still a layer of zona pellucida around it. Now, even though the zona pellucida is there, separating the granulosa cells from the actual egg, the granulosa cells can still nourish the egg through gap junctions that go through the zona pellucida and into the egg. Gap junctions are just little passageways from one cell to another cell where they can exchange nutrients or other signals. And actually, through those gap junctions, the granulosa cells send through little chemicals that keep those primary oocytes stuck at that meiosis 1 stage. Because you remember, at this point, all of these primary oocytes are stuck in meiotic arrest. They're not dividing and reducing their chromosome copy number. So as we develop from our primordial to our primary to our next follicle here, called our preantral follicle, and you'll see why it's called that in a minute, the granulosa cells are actually starting to divide and become a lot greater in number. You can see that there's a pretty big difference in granulosa cell number from our primary follicles to our preantral follicle here. And remember, the granulosa cells are shaded in purple here. So while the granulosa cells are proliferating, this wall on the outside of the follicle called the theca starts to form. Theca cells have receptors for luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. And when luteinizing hormone, or LH, binds these theca cells, they produce a hormone called androstenedione. And when the thecas get androstenedione, they give it to the granulosa cells, who then convert it to estrogen and release it into the blood. So the blood estrogen levels start to go up at this point. And so that's what these red and blue bits running down the middle of the ovary are, blood vessels, arteries, and veins. And if they look a little bit weird to you or unusual, that's just because they're cut in cross-section as well. Now you might be wondering what an antral refers to, like what you see in the preantral follicle and this early antral follicle here. It actually refers to the antrum, which will be formed in the next step. This space here is called an antrum. And the antrum is just basically fluid that's being produced by the granulosa cells. And it's that antrum and the fluid in the antrum that pushes against the edges of the follicle and causes it to expand. Now, just so you're aware, during this ovarian cycle, multiple follicles are actually forming. It's not just this one preantral follicle and then this one early antral follicle and this one mature follicle. You're getting a lot of these happening at one time, but only one of the biggest ones is the one that eventually gets ovulated, because you only ovulate one egg every 28 days. And that one that gets ovulated is called the dominant follicle. So let's just say that what we're seeing here is an example of the dominant follicle's development. Because the rest of the ones that we're developing along this pathway sort of degenerate and die off in a process called atresia. And I'll write that at the bottom here. And atresia just means to degenerate. So another note, in the ones that undergo atresia, both the follicle and the eggs they contain die off. And that means that a woman loses anywhere between 15 to 25 eggs per menstrual cycle to atresia, while only one gets ovulated. So you can kind of imagine how you go from 2 to 4 million eggs when you were born to having 0 after about 35-ish years of ovulation. It's not just that one egg you lose via ovulation, you lose quite a few. So anyway, back to the development of the dominant follicle. It enlarges mostly due to the expanding antrum, as I mentioned earlier, and granulosa cells actually start to form this bit of a mound here that protrudes into the middle of the antrum. This mound of granulosa cells is called the cumulus oovarus, As part of the development of the dominant follicle, the cumulus oophorus and the egg sort of separate together from the wall of the follicle and float around in the middle of the antrum like a little island. And the follicle increases in size, so the actual follicle is increasing in size as it gets filled with more and more fluid from the granulosa cells. And the granulosa cells are just producing fluid as a byproduct of their metabolism and creation of hormones. Eventually, this dominant follicle, which at this point is called a mature follicle, it starts to balloon out the side of the ovary, kind of like this. It just starts to push out against the edge of the ovary. And then because the edge of the ovary and the wall of the mature follicle are in such close proximity, enzymes within the follicle break down that common wall between them, and the egg pops out onto the surface of the ovary because now this wall is broken down. And by the way, an enzyme is a protein that carries out a specific task. The task here is to break down the wall between the mature follicle and the ovary. And that happens on day 14, so it takes days 0 to 13 of buildup to get to this event. When this happens, some women feel a little bit of pelvic pain. And actually, sometimes by chance, 2 or more follicles reach maturity and they all pop out. And that's how you get twins or triplets or quadruplets or octuplets, when they all pop out and get fertilized by different sperm each, because they're all subsequently swept up into the uterine tubes where sperm can fertilize them. So now you have the egg out here, but what about the old follicle it was in? The follicle actually collapses a little and transforms into a structure called the corpus luteum. And in this transformation, the granulosa cells get a lot bigger and start to produce more estrogen, progesterone, and that other hormone inhibin that we mentioned before. Just briefly, inhibin lowers the amount of FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, that comes from the anterior pituitary. And it does that because follicle-stimulating hormone actually propagates this whole process of follicle maturation, as you can imagine from the name. So if you didn't know this before, these are the exact follicles that follicle-stimulating hormone refers to, at least in a female. Anyway, if the egg doesn't get fertilized, then the corpus luteum reaches a maximum size in about 10 days, so that's about day 25, which it's probably sitting at in this diagram. And then it degenerates by apoptosis. That's a process that cells use to sort of self-destruct and die off. And here I'm abbreviating corpus luteum as CL, just so you know what I mean. But if the egg is fertilized, i.e. it travels into the uterine tubes and gets fertilized by sperm, then the corpus luteum persists. I mean, it keeps living, because we want it to keep producing estrogen and progesterone. That's because estrogen and progesterone prepare the inner lining of the uterus, and that's called the endometrium, for implantation, which would be really handy since we have a fertilized egg now that needs to develop. And that's where it does it, by implanting in the endometrium of the uterus. So just a final note, ovulation doesn't happen forever. At about age 50 to 51, females undergo something called menopause. First, menstrual cycles become less and less regular. In other words, they don't happen every 28 days like they do when you're under the age of 50. And then ultimately they stop happening entirely. And that cessation of ovulation is called menopause. The main cause of menopause is sometimes referred to as ovarian failure. Basically, the ovaries lose the ability to respond to signaling hormones from the brain called gonadotropins. And we know these as LH and FSH. And this happens because most or all of the follicles in eggs have already gone through that process that we talked about called atresia. In other words, they've degenerated.
Well, I really love that that video, and I'm glad I was able to share it with you. I know that we're running long. Raise your hand if you're interested in continuing with the other two videos, the one on PCOS and the other one on uterine cancer or ovarian cancer. I don't see any hands. Can you all hear me? Okay, so Samuel, you'd like to continue. Mila, would you like to continue? Hello, Mila. Okay. Anybody else? I see Thecla's dropped off, so we just go ahead with Samuel. Let's go on, Mila. Let's hit PCOS.
Someone recently comment on my YouTube channel. They wanted to know, why am I getting PCOS? I'm not even 18 years old. So I wanted to create this quick video on PCOS just to explain the simplicity of it so you really understand it. Polycystic ovarian syndrome. Poly means many, and then we have the word cyst. Okay, many cysts. But in reality, it's not true. It's not really cyst, it's follicles, but I'm not going to get into that. But for right now, just understand that there's these little bumps growing, and there's many of them on the ovary. Okay, so we have polycystic ovarian and then syndrome. Now, a syndrome is not necessarily a disease. It's suggestive of a disease, but it's a disorder having more than one symptom that suggests a disease. Okay, so, all right, so what are the symptoms? Infrequent or prolonged menstrual cycle, excess male hormones, as in androgens, infertility, excessive hair growth throughout your body, thinning of the hair on your head, acne, and insulin resistance. Now, if you look up this condition on Wikipedia, it will give you a lot of general information that is not very helpful. They'll talk about the cause being genetic. They'll talk about the cause being potentially environmental. Also, they will tell you that PCOS has no cure, but it can be treated with metformin. Anytime you're trying to figure out some mysterious medical condition, realize that there's usually one key factor that you need to know to figure it out. There's one piece of information that explains everything, and that is rarely, if ever, found in Wikipedia or the first page or second page or third page on Google when you do searches. And so one thing that I'm really interested in is doing videos on that key piece of information so you can figure everything out. With PCOS, the key piece of information is this: high androgens can be caused by high levels of insulin. Okay, that's what you need to know. In other words, every single one of these symptoms right here is coming from high androgens because you have high levels of insulin. Now, what's interesting is that they rarely ever check insulin levels. They'll check your blood sugar levels. Now, you cannot determine what's happening with insulin by checking your blood sugars, because you could have normal blood sugars, yet have high levels of insulin, because the insulin resistance will buffer some of that blood sugar response until a certain point where it can't buffer it, and then it can't compensate, and you become a pre-diabetic and a diabetic. But for right now, all you need to know is that your high androgens are coming from the high levels of insulin. That's why they treat it with metformin, because metformin treats insulin resistance, which will help regulate your insulin levels and help normalize them, okay? But what's behind high levels of insulin? Well, if you're new to my channel, almost every single video I have is related to that one topic. You need to do healthy keto and intermittent fasting as your primary eating plan to help you regulate your insulin levels, and then get your PCOS reevaluated, because you are probably going to find that you have a lot less problems with this disorder. Why? Because you're getting to the root cause. If you're new to my channel and you want to know what to do, I put a link down right below of exactly what you should be eating. Hey, before you go, real quick, I have a...
All right. So PCOS is suffered by women who have too much androgens in their bloodstream. That's either a precursor to testosterone or separate from testosterone, but basically it's too much. And you saw most of the symptoms were associated with male pattern baldness or that sort of thing, too much, acne. So we wanted to bring that out, and it's uncomfortable for women to be to that, because their menstrual cycle is all messed up. Okay. Now, I don't necessarily want to go to the next one on PCOS, but let's hit the one on ovarian cancer, Mila.
The ovaries are the female reproductive glands. They consist of 3 types of cells: epithelial, germ, and stromal. When the cells in the ovaries grow abnormally, they develop into tumors that can be non-cancerous or cancerous. If cancerous tumors are not detected early, the cancer cells can spread from the ovaries throughout the pelvic region and continue to spread to the abdominal area and other organs. Determining the stage of ovarian cancer is very important in developing a treatment plan. At stage 1, cancer is limited to one or both of the ovaries. In stage 2, ovarian cancer extends to the pelvis area. In stage 3, ovarian cancer has spread to the abdominal region. In stage 4, ovarian cancer extends into the liver, or to locations beyond the abdominal area. Ovarian cancer treatment typically includes surgery, chemotherapy, radiation therapy, or a combination of therapies.
Generally speaking,
So looking at the, oh, go ahead, Mila. What was that?
I just kind of curious about ovarian cancer. It's a very serious disease.
Yeah, we hear about ovarian cancers and how they can really destroy a person's life in more ways than one, and it's quite disruptive. And again, it goes back to, okay, what can we do to help people? Well, once the person has cancer, then the medical community needs to be involved, and they need to everybody needs to be working towards that. The use of antioxidants to limit the number of inflamed cells in our bodies is a very, very important component of not being subject to cancers, let alone of any kind. And we can go down the path. I think prevention is a whole lot better than trying to cure, but we can go past that. What happened to this slide? Oh my gosh. How'd that get? It must be the difference between systems. Anyway, nutrition is key to our hormonal controls. Why? Because we need to be able to talk to the cells, and we need to be able to protect them from deterioration. We need to be able to protect our glands and our cells within those glands from deterioration, so they can continue doing their proper job. And as we talked about early on in this series about nutrition and behavioral health, that's where the most of the studies that we'll find associated with behavior and hormones are involved. And they're finding more and more the relationship between proper nutrition and the way people act is real, that there's a direct correlation between having optimum nutrition and having optimal mental health. And if you have optimal mental health, it means obviously your hormones are working properly, which then means that your glands are tend to be working properly as well. Now, as we talk about proper nutrition and getting the right nutrition, we also have to make sure that people understand that stupidity is not fixed by nutrition. That is, you do stupid things, it's hard to fix, right? So eating the wrong things is detrimental to hormonal balance and your health. So you need to be very careful about the quality of what you eat in regards to your nutritional, and then also to not eat things that are unhealthy for you. And make sure that in either case, whatever you do is done in the appropriate amount of moderation. So the aspect of it is nutritional deficiencies, all right, impair function. And therefore optimum levels can resume or enhance function. And that is in keeping with the teachings of Dr. Myron Wentz and the scientists at USANA is that we're all seeking to achieve that optimum health and making sure that it all goes in. Now you can see this recipe of estrogen, all right? And what does this come out to you, right away? Okay, everybody turn on their mics and turn on their, because this is more than just a quiz. Okay, this goes fundamentally back to everything that we've been teaching since day one when I first started doing these courses, is that it's really difficult to say, well, vitamin C does this and vitamin D goes that, because they all act together. And they have to act together in the right formula or balanced formulations that are necessary. And Lord knows that if you're just taking individual bottles of any particular supplement, even if they are great supplements, that is, that they do exactly what their label says and that they're pure and that they're kind and they're not going to solve, if they're a single unit, then how do you know that you're getting the right formulation of each and every single thing that your body needs to do what it needs to do? And I as much as you can study and balance and so forth, it'd be really difficult for you to replace the science that's done in the USANA laboratories. And in coming up with the cell centrals, what you're looking at here is pretty much a great list of things. There's a lot more in the cell centrals batch, but it's, you're looking at the selenium, the magnesium, the zinc, the cysteine, that's L-cysteine antioxidant, okay, the choline. It all comes together to create the healthy environment, as well as to create the proper hormone that you need for the proper functioning of your body in so many different ways. And we saw in this presentation today the makeup of how complex the relationships are. And if any one of those relationships is off, then trouble occurs. And so what we want to do is to get it back on cycle and to be able to get it operating properly. And to do that is to make sure you're getting the right formulation and dosage of the essential macronutrients, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, lipids, everything in one package. So knowing that, I would say that in this recipe for estrogen, my store to go to get all the ingredients is the USANA Cell Centrals. Next slide. I think that's me. There we go. And this one fell out of way too, but essentially we've been through this before. We've talked about the nutrition and health, the health and the mood, the feelings, behaviors, and how the behaviors and relationships go together. And this is all working together now in terms of hormones and the endocrine cycle. These references are available to you. And you want to go to the next slide. There we go. All right. So our next class is February 19th. It will be part 2, and we're going to do several things. We're going to talk about the ovarian cycle, and we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle, how they're tied together and how they regulate the body, and of course, how they makes you feel, how they support your health. And so we have a better understanding of this cycle when we get into the next part of our orientation, which is going to be back into relationships. All right, and that brings us to the end, and we are at 1 hour and 26 minutes. So I apologize for being over, but it is one indication about the complexity of what we're talking about and why it is so important to each and every one of us to get the right nutrition and to take care of ourselves so that we do not fall prey to poor nutrition